The small market town of Flaxborough sat snugly between the green hills of the countryside, its sleepy lanes and neat rows of brick cottages untroubled by the demands of the outside world. Time moved slowly here, and the rhythms of life were steady and dependable. For those who lived here, the greatest excitement usually came from the annual flower show or the Tuesday council meetings, both of which were more about socializing than actual business. But on a crisp autumn morning, something out of place disturbed the placid order of Flaxborough's daily routine. The Cathedral Lodge, a modest but well-regarded establishment near the town square, had long been a favorite of passing travelers, its timbered beams and thick ivy-clad walls lending it an air of quiet comfort. A place for dignitaries to rest, or for weary pilgrims to catch their breath on the way to the cathedral. It was the sort of place where nothing ever really happened. But that morning, the scene in room 17, a corner room with a view of the churchyard, was one that would set tongues wagging for weeks. It began with the discovery of Sister Agnes. She was a nun, as everyone in Flaxborough knew, travelling through town on some church business. The priest who had accompanied her, Father Dominic O'Neill, a stout retiring man with a fondness for quietly muttering prayers over his breakfast, had been found, dazed and agitated, pacing in the lobby of the lodge. His hands trembled as he clutched a heavy, leather-bound Bible to his chest. His lips moved in silent recitations, as though pleading with some unseen force for forgiveness. Room 17, however, was far less serene. The door had been ajar when the chambermaid arrived with fresh towels, and the grisly scene inside nearly sent the poor woman into fits. Sister Agnes lay motionless on the floor, her head resting at an odd angle, a stark contrast to the calm of the simple monastic surroundings. Her habit, traditionally white and neat, was now a shadow of its former state. And in her hand, clutched tightly, was a small rosary, her fingers curled around it in a death grip. At first glance it seemed like nothing more than a tragic accident. Perhaps she had tripped, or her faint health had betrayed her in the night. But a closer inspection, perhaps a moment too late for the maid's comfort, revealed the unmistakable signs of violence. A thin trickle of blood from the back of her head staining the floor in the shape of an almost deliberate pattern. The news spread like wildfire through Flaxborough. By midday, every shopkeeper, clerk and bus driver knew of the incident. They did what small-town folk did best. They gossiped. "Oh, I heard she'd been seen arguing with Father O'Neill just the day before." Mrs. Barker, the florist, was telling anyone who would listen as she arranged chrysanthemums in her shop window. "Quite a heated exchange from what I understand. Perhaps that's what happened." "Don't be ridiculous," Mr. Fawcett, the butcher, chimed in from the door of his shop. "A nun and a priest? What could possibly have happened? Surely she just had a turn. Or perhaps she was pushed," suggested Mrs. Jenkins, who ran the corner newsagent. "I've always said there was something odd about that priest. Always so quiet, always staring at his hands, like he knows something he's not telling." And thus the rumors began. The notion of a quiet and tragic accident evaporated in the heat of speculation. People began to whisper that the priest had something to hide, and the town was ripe for scandal. It was not long before the local constabulary, led by Chief Inspector John Purbright, became involved. Purbright, a man of understated presence and deliberate movements, arrived at the Cathedral Lodge that afternoon. He was dressed in his usual grey suit, meticulously pressed, though the faintest hint of wear in his cuffs betrayed his long years of service. His sharp eyes took in the scene, the low murmur of the constables, the small crowd gathering just outside the hotel, the flickering light through the windows that seemed to echo the town's growing anxiety. "I understand there was an incident," Purbright said softly, not to anyone in particular, but in such a way that his words seemed to settle over the room like a fine dust. "Ah, yes, sir," Constable Harris replied, looking both relieved and anxious at the same time. "The tragic accident, sir. Sister Agnes found dead in room 17. "I see," Purbright said, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at the priest, who was now sitting on a small chair in the corner of the lobby, his hands still clutching the Bible. His face was ashen, though he had stopped muttering his prayers. "Perhaps I should speak with Father O'Neill," Purbright said, turning toward the priest. The constables exchanged nervous glances. He's rather distressed, sir. Perhaps it would be best if we handle the questioning. Purbright's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. That's very kind of you, Harris, but I think I'll speak with him myself. The priest looked up. As Purbright approached, his eyes glazed over yet filled with an unspoken terror. Father O'Neill, Purbright began, his voice low and respectful. I understand you were in room 17 with Sister Agnes. The priest nodded slowly, the tremble in his hands betraying his otherwise composed appearance. Yes, Inspector, I was with her, but I don't know what happened. She must have had a turn. I didn't do anything, Inspector, I swear. Purbright paused, studying the priest. His gaze was sharp yet soft, as if looking past the words and into something deeper. It must have been quite a shock, Father, to find her like that. Yes, the priest said faintly. I didn't know what to do. Purbright studied the small beads of perspiration forming on the priest's forehead, the slight quiver in his voice. Nothing in his words was overtly suspicious, but there was an odd hesitation in his manner that Purbright had learned to recognize over the years. People, particularly those trying to hide something, didn't always have the words. Purbright smiled faintly, his tone soothing. Tell me, Father, was there anyone else in the room last night? Father O'Neill paused, the air thick with his hesitation. No. No one. Purbright's smile lingered just a moment too long. Are you sure? The priest's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. Perhaps there is more to this than meets the eye, Purbright thought quietly to himself, and so it began, a quiet investigation into a crime that had all the markings of something far more intricate than a mere accident. A priest who killed a nun? Or was there something else at play in Flaxborough? Time would tell, but for Purbright the first question had already been asked. Purbright stood silently for a moment, observing Father O'Neill. The priest's eyes had not met his, and his nervous tapping on the worn leather cover of the Bible grew louder, as though trying to drown out the heavy silence between them. There was something about the man's discomfort that spoke louder than any words. His hands shook not from the cold, but from a deeper, unspoken fear. It was often in such moments of subtle tension that Purbright's mind would wander, sifting through the details and contradictions of what was said, and more tellingly, what was left unsaid. His thoughts returned briefly to the state of the room, the peculiar angle of Sister Agnes's body, the blood that had stained the floor in an almost deliberate pattern. Nothing about it spoke of a sudden, unfortunate collapse. The more he thought about it, the more he began to suspect that there was more to this tragedy than a mere accident, more than the priest's plea of innocence. Father O'Neill, Purbright began, his voice even, may I ask you about your relationship with Sister Agnes? The priest flinched, the smallest of movements, but Purbright noticed it. Father O'Neill, who had been staring into the distance as if trying to gather his thoughts, now fixed his gaze on Purbright. I don't understand, Inspector. The priest stammered, still clutching his Bible tighter, his fingers turning white around the edges. We were simply travelling together as part of a parish duty. She was a kind woman, devout. Did you get along well? Purbright continued, his tone casual, probing. Sister Agnes, I mean. Was she in good spirits? Was there anything unusual about her behaviour? The priest's response came too quickly, a touch too eager. Yes, of course, she was perfectly fine. Nothing unusual about her at all. His voice trailed off, as if he were trying to convince himself more than, Purbright, then why was she arguing with you yesterday? Purbright asked gently, as though he were merely restating a well-known fact. Father O'Neill stiffened visibly. His lips parted, as though to defend himself, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The room, silent except for the sound of distant footsteps on the stairs, seemed to close in around them. Arguing? The priest's voice faltered. No. That's not... I don't know where you've heard that from, but it's not true. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. We had a disagreement, yes. But nothing like you're implying. It was just a misunderstanding. Purbright let the silence linger for a moment. It was a small detail. but one that caught his attention. The priest was too quick to deny something that had been part of the town's gossip from the outset. A small-town scandal was usually a matter of public interest, and the locals were often keen to get the facts right, if not always in the most respectful way. "How long had you known Sister Agnes, Father?" Purbright asked, his voice now softer, almost coaxing. "Several months. She arrived at the parish recently, and we've been working together since. She was a fine person." "And your parish work brought you to Flaxborough?" The priest nodded slowly, as though grappling with his own thoughts. "Yes, but we were only passing through. Nothing more." Purbright's mind was racing, now picking through the priest's words, his actions, and the small flickers of hesitation in his responses. There was something unnatural about his insistence, something that didn't quite add up. A man who had nothing to hide wouldn't be so eager to steer the conversation away from specifics. There was a gap, perhaps a large one, that Purbright would have to close. The priest, clearly trying to regain some control over the conversation, sat up straighter. "You should focus on the others, Inspector. There were others staying here that night." Purbright didn't respond immediately. He simply gave the priest a look, one that wasn't aggressive, but one that had an unmistakable weight behind it. It was the sort of look that told a man he had been heard, but not entirely believed. The priest shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the unspoken truth hanging heavily in the air between them. "I'm not interested in distractions, Father. I'm interested in the truth," Purbright said, his voice calm yet firm. He gave the priest a long, meaningful glance, one that suggested they both knew there was much more to this story than met the eye. Father O'Neill seemed to shrink under his gaze, his shoulders slumping slightly, as though the very air had become heavier. "I don't know what else to tell you, Inspector. I didn't do anything. I was with her, and then she was dead." His voice cracked on the final word, and the priest's gaze fell to the floor in shame. Purbright nodded slowly, absorbing the priest's reaction. His instincts were alert now. There was a tremor of guilt, yes, but it wasn't the kind one would expect from a man confessing a crime. Instead, it felt more like the kind of guilt born out of an inconvenient truth, a truth that would soon come to light. The silence between them thickened, and for a brief moment, Purbright felt the pull of the town's intrigue tugging at him. This was no ordinary accident, and Father O'Neill was no mere innocent bystander. "I'll be back, Father," Purbright said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll speak again soon." The priest's only response was a nervous nod, his gaze still fixed on the floor, unwilling or unable to meet Purbright's eyes any longer. Purbright turned and exited the room, his mind already turning over the details, searching for something that didn't yet make sense. There was a pattern here, a small but crucial clue that he had yet to uncover. Sister Agnes's death had been no accident, and Purbright was certain that the truth lay buried beneath layers of unspoken words and hidden motives. As he made his way down the narrow corridor of the lodge, the sound of his footsteps seemed to echo louder than before, as though the building itself was waiting for him to discover the secret it held within its walls. The town of Flaxborough, so used to its gentle routines and harmless gossip, was about to face a truth that would unravel everything. But for now, Purbright knew the first step was to ask the right questions and wait for the answers to reveal themselves. The quiet murmur of the town seemed to follow Purbright as he left the cathedral lodge. The early evening air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of fragrance that made Flaxborough feel like an isolated pocket of tranquility, untouched by the chaos of the world beyond. Yet beneath the surface calm a storm was brewing, and Purbright knew it. He could feel it in his bones, in the small shifts of atmosphere that whispered at the edges of his perception. This wasn't an ordinary case. His first instinct, when faced with a seemingly straightforward death, was to avoid jumping to conclusions. The truth, he had learned, was seldom as obvious as it appeared. The priest's behavior, the nervous tremor in his voice, the strange insistence on the accident, it all seemed calculated, as if Father O'Neill was trying to steer the conversation in one direction, while avoiding a far more uncomfortable reality. But Purbright also knew that for all his outward composure, O'Neill was hiding something, not necessarily guilt, but perhaps something more complex, something that would take time to untangle. By the time Purbright reached the small office at the local constabulary, the sun had dipped behind the rooftops, leaving the town bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The constables had already been briefed on the incident, though no new details had emerged. He'd hoped for more, but in a town like Flaxborough, information trickled in slowly, filtered by gossip, speculation, and the quiet confidence of its inhabitants that they were untouchable. Purbright sat at his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the cold wood. The town was small, but its people were many and varied. Someone must know something. It was just a matter of who and when. There were no coincidences, no chance meetings, and every word spoken, no matter how casual, had meaning. His thoughts returned to the peculiar pattern of blood in room 17. Was it symbolic? Was it intentional? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Without waiting for a response, Constable Harris entered, his face unusually pale. "Sir, there's something you should see." Purbright raised an eyebrow but said nothing, following Harris, out of the office and toward the small holding cell at the back of the station. The walls, damp and grey, seemed to close in around him as they moved down the narrow corridor, the air heavy with the scent of old stone and must. Inside the cell, sitting quietly in a wooden chair, was a woman, a tall, slender figure with strikingly sharp features. Her clothes were simple but neat, and there was something oddly detached in the way she sat, her hands folded on her lap. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to pierce through the dim light of the station, as though they saw something Purbright couldn't. "This is Eleanor Finch," Harris explained, his voice low. "She checked into the Cathedral Lodge late yesterday evening, just before the incident. She's been staying in room 6, directly across from the victim. I thought you might want to speak with her, sir." Purbright stepped into the small room, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. There was an air of quiet defiance about her, a stillness that hinted at a mind used to keeping secrets. He didn't know what to make of her yet, but something about her presence didn't sit right. "Miss Finch," Purbright said, his voice calm but sharp, "I understand you were staying at the Cathedral Lodge the night Sister Agnes was found, dead." She nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, that's correct. Did you hear anything unusual? Any sounds, voices, anything out of place?" Purbright asked, watching her closely. She remained silent for a moment, as though considering. Her response carefully. When she spoke, her voice was smooth, almost too smooth. "I didn't hear anything, Inspector. I'm not the sort of person who eavesdrops on my neighbours." She paused, a faint smile playing at the edges of her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "But I can't speak for anyone else." Purbright studied her, his mind working over her words. There was an odd cadence to her speech, an undertone of something hidden just beneath the surface. She was either being deliberately vague or she had a particular reason for withholding information. Either way, it was becoming clear that she wasn't just another innocent bystander. "Did you know Sister Agnes, Miss Finch?" Purbright asked, keeping his tone even. "No," she replied quickly, her eyes flickering for the briefest of moments. "I had never met her. I was just passing through town like everyone else." Purbright stepped closer, his voice taking on a more direct edge. "What business brought you here? Why stay at the Cathedral Lodge?" She shifted slightly in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "That's none of your business, Inspector." Purbright allowed a moment of silence to stretch between them. He was not in a hurry, not at all. If anything, he was becoming more intrigued by her resistance. There was something in her reluctance to answer, something that told him there was more to her story. "Do you have any idea why a priest and a nun would be staying at the same hotel?" Purbright asked, his tone casual, as if the question was nothing more than idle curiosity. Eleanor's lips pressed together in a tight line, but she didn't answer right away. Her fingers twitched ever so slightly, betraying her unease. "I suppose they were both on their way to somewhere important, just like me." Purbright nodded, but he didn't move. There was something in the way she had said, "just like me," as though she were trying to mirror herself to the people around her, as though trying to make her story fit in with theirs. He didn't believe her. He wasn't sure why yet, but he knew her words held less truth than she was letting on. "Miss Finch, I'm sure you understand that the circumstances of Sister Agnes's death are far from ordinary. I don't think you're telling me everything you know." Purbright leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And I think you know far more than you're letting on." For the first time, Eleanor's expression shifted, the faintest flicker of tension crossing her face, before she regained control. "I told you everything, Inspector. You have nothing more to hear from me." Purbright held her gaze unwavering. "We'll see about that." As he turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. Eleanor Finch was hiding something. Whether she was directly involved in Sister Agnes's death or merely a witness to something far darker, Purbright was certain that her silence was more telling than her words. Outside, the evening had deepened into full darkness, the street lamps casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The case was far from over, but for the first time Purbright felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together, just enough for him to see that the truth was far murkier than he had imagined. The night had fallen silent as Purbright made his way back through the town, the usual hum of conversation having died down as the people of Flaxborough settled into their homes. There was something almost unnerving about the quiet, as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move in a game whose rules had yet to be fully revealed. The constables had been courteous, offering him what little they could. Harris was eager to keep the investigation on track, but there were still too many gaps in the story. The priest's insistence that nothing unusual had occurred, the maid's hasty account of the discovery, and Eleanor Finch's cryptic refusal to offer more than the barest details. None of it added up. And yet each detail felt deliberate. Someone was trying to keep the truth from surfacing, and Purbright had made it his job to uncover it. As he passed the familiar sights of the square, shops now closed, the church bell tower looming against the dark sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something small, something insignificant at first glance but ultimately crucial. His thoughts kept returning to Father O'Neill's nervousness, to Eleanor Finch's strange detachment, and the odd pattern of blood that had been found near Sister Agnes. It had all been too tidy, too easily explained away. A woman dead in a guest room, a priest who seemed too eager to deny suspicion, a passerby with secrets of her own. But people were never quite as straightforward as they seemed. Purbright had learned long ago that the most telling details were often the smallest, the ones that slipped by unnoticed in the rush to make sense of a situation. It wasn't the priest's denial or the maid's gossip that would lead him to the truth, but the overlooked bits of conversation, the things that didn't fit into the story everyone was telling. He paused as he passed the corner of the churchyard, his gaze falling on the stone walls that framed the graveyard. The soft glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the weathered tombstones, their ancient engravings half obscured by the creeping ivy. There was something peaceful about it, yet something uneasy, too, as though the dead had stories to tell, stories the living had long since forgotten. A movement caught his eye, a figure crossing the road ahead, moving quickly, almost as though they were avoiding being seen. Purbright's instincts kicked in immediately, and he began to follow, keeping a discreet distance. The figure ducked into an alleyway, and Purbright's pace quickened. Whoever it was, they seemed intent on remaining unnoticed. As he rounded the corner, he found himself facing a narrow passage between two buildings, the cobblestones slick with moisture from the evening mist. The figure had disappeared into the shadows, but Purbright could hear the faint rustle of movement ahead. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his footsteps muffled by the mist. Turning the corner, he saw the figure again. A woman, tall and slender, her face half hidden in the dim light. She was fumbling with something in her hand, and as she looked up, their eyes met. It was Eleanor Finch. She didn't appear surprised to see him, though she did seem to hesitate for a fraction of a second before turning on her heel and walking briskly down the alley. Purbright didn't hesitate either. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Miss Finch," he called out, "I think we need to talk." She paused, her back still turned to him, and for a moment Purbright thought she might keep walking. But then she stopped, her shoulders sagging slightly in resignation. Slowly she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I told you everything I know, Inspector," she said, her voice cold. "There's nothing more I can say." Purbright's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not here to argue with you, Miss Finch. I'm here because something's not right. You're hiding something, and I'm not leaving until you tell me what it is." For a long moment she said nothing, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Purbright could see the gears turning in her mind, weighing the options, deciding whether it was worth trying to cover her tracks any longer. Finally she spoke, her voice softer now. "You don't understand. I didn't want to get involved in any of this, but now it's too late." Purbright stepped closer, his tone insistent but measured. "What do you mean? What's too late?" Eleanor's eyes darted to the side, as if checking for anyone else nearby, and then she took a deep breath. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this, but now it's all falling apart." Purbright's pulse quickened. "What wasn't supposed to happen? What are you talking about?" She bit her lip, looking uncertain, but then, as if making up her mind, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't kill her. I swear, but I was there. I saw everything." Purbright's heart raced. "You saw what?" Eleanor glanced around again, then stepped closer to him, her voice dropping lower. "Father O'Neill, he wasn't just a priest. He was something else. He had secrets, things he was hiding, and Sister Agnes—" She shook her head as if unable to finish the thought. "Go on," Purbright urged, his voice now a quiet command. Eleanor hesitated, then gave in, speaking in a rush. She knew, she found out, about the priest, about what he was doing, and that's why he— She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening in sudden panic. "I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have said anything. You can't—" Purbright took a step closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me what happened, everything. Don't leave anything out." But Eleanor shook her head, backing away slowly. "I've said too much already. I've got to go. You'll never understand. Just forget you ever saw me." Before Purbright could stop her, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving him standing in the alley, his mind racing with the fragments of what she had said. The priest had secrets. Sister Agnes had known something, and whatever it was, it had led to her death. But what exactly had she discovered? And why had Eleanor been involved? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they were far from the whole picture. Purbright knew one thing for certain now. This case was far more complicated than he had imagined. The quiet town of Flaxborough was hiding a dark truth, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter how long it took. Purbright stood in the alleyway, the soft mist swirling around his feet, as the last of Eleanor Finch's hurried footsteps faded into the distance. Her sudden departure left a heavy silence hanging in the air. For a moment he was motionless, piecing together the fragments of their brief conversation. She had been involved in something, no doubt about it. But what exactly? The sense of unease that had been creeping over him for days now tightened its grip. Something about the way Eleanor had acted, so on edge, so willing to share only just enough, told him that she was hiding a significant truth, but she wasn't the only one. Father O'Neill, too, had a story to tell, and Purbright was certain that the priest's role in this mystery extended far beyond his initial claims of innocence. The question was not whether the priest had a secret, it was what that secret was, and how far it reached. With his mind racing, Purbright walked back toward the constabulary, each step feeling heavier than the last. The streetlights flickered dimly as he passed, the shadows seeming to stretch longer in the low light. The case had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated, and yet, in a way, he couldn't help but feel that he had been waiting for this. A story like this didn't stay buried forever. It always found its way to the surface. By the time he reached the small office, the warmth of the fire inside did little to chase away the chill that had settled in his bones. He needed answers, and he needed them quickly. His first stop would be Father O'Neill. The priest had to know more than he was letting on. But he also knew that getting to the truth would require patience, something Purbright had in abundance. Inside the station, Constable Harris was waiting. His face was still drawn, his usual confidence replaced by an air of quiet concern. As Purbright sat down at his desk, Harris cleared his throat, his eyes lingering on the papers spread out before him. "Anything new, sir?" Harris asked, though. His tone suggested he already knew the answer. Purbright nodded slowly. "A bit more. Finch knows something important, but she's not willing to talk. I don't think she's involved in the death itself, But she knows more about the priest and Sister Agnes than she's letting on. Harris furrowed his brow. You think she's just covering for him? I don't know, Purbright replied, his voice thoughtful. But I know she's scared. And when people are scared, they reveal things, just not always on their terms. I see, Harris said quietly. So, what's the next step? The priest, Purbright said, his gaze sharpening. We need to press him harder. I don't believe his story, not for a second. Harris nodded. I'll arrange it, sir. We'll need to be careful, though. He's a man of the cloth, and his reputation in town is, well, you know how people are. Purbright gave a half smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'm not interested in his reputation, Harris. I'm interested in the truth. As Harris left the room to make arrangements, Purbright turned his attention back to the papers on his desk. There was something strange about the timing of everything. Sister Agnes had been killed, yes, but why? And what had Eleanor Finch been involved in that made her so fearful of revealing what she knew? Purbright thought back to the earlier conversation with the priest, the way he had recoiled at the suggestion that anything unusual had occurred. There was something about his insistence on the mundane that seemed all too rehearsed. The evening wore on, and by the time Purbright made his way back to the cathedral lodge, the air had grown colder. He walked through the front door, his presence immediately noticed by the few remaining guests in the lobby. They watched him with a mix of curiosity and wariness, as though they knew he was there for more than just a routine check-in. Purbright ignored them, his focus singular as he made his way toward the stairs. Room 17 awaited him, though the scene that had greeted him earlier that day felt like a distant memory. The room had been tidied up, the remnants of the tragedy carefully erased, but Purbright knew that a clean room didn't erase the stains of the past. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the spot where Sister Agnes's body had lain. Nothing seemed out of place, but Purbright's instincts told him to look closer. His gaze swept over the room, its simple furnishings, the worn carpet, the small wooden desk, and then he spotted it. A piece of paper, half hidden beneath the bed, its edges crumpled as though it had been hastily discarded. Purbright bent down, picking it up and unfolding it carefully. The words on the paper were written in a delicate hand, but they were hardly comforting. I know what you did. If you don't stop, I will tell the others. I will tell everyone. Purbright's heart skipped a beat. The words were unmistakable, and they could only mean one thing. Sister Agnes had known something the priest and perhaps others had wanted to keep hidden. But what was it? And why had she been killed for it? Purbright stood up slowly, his mind working furiously. He had suspected as much, but this note confirmed it. There was more to this than a simple murder. It was a cover-up, a secret that was worth killing for. The door opened behind him and Harris entered, his face serious. We're ready, sir. Father O'Neill is waiting. Purbright turned, the note still clutched in his hand. Let's go. It's time we had a word with Father O'Neill, and this time we won't be so accommodating. They made their way to the priest's quarters, the quiet hum of the town's night air muffled by the thick walls of the lodge. Inside, Father O'Neill was seated at a small wooden table, his Bible open before him, though his hands weren't moving to turn the pages. He seemed lost in thought. But when he saw Purbright and Harris enter, he stiffened. I trust you've had a chance to think over our conversation, Purbright said, his voice calm but with an edge to it. I have, the priest replied, his voice taut. And I stand by what I said. I did not harm Sister Agnes. Purbright stepped closer, the note still in his hand. You're right, Father. You didn't harm her, but you did something far worse. You made her a threat to your secret. And that was a mistake. Father O'Neill's face paled, his lips tightening. I don't know what you're talking about. Purbright smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. You will, but not for long. And with that, the final piece clicked into place. Father O'Neill's expression faltered for the briefest moment, before he quickly regained control, his hands tightening around the Bible. Purbright noted the subtle tremor in the priest's fingers. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something that clung to him like a second skin. The priest was struggling to maintain his composure, but his guilt was starting to crack through the facade. Purbright didn't press further yet. Instead, he placed the crumpled note he had found on the table in front of Father O'Neill. The priest's eyes flickered toward it, and for a moment his breath caught. Purbright waited, watching the priest carefully, noting every shift in his posture, every fleeting glance. "I think you know why I'm here, Father," Purbright said, quietly, his tone calm but firm. "This note was left behind by Sister Agnes. Do you recognize it?" O'Neill's eyes locked on the note, but he said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, thick like smoke. The priest's lips parted slightly, but no words emerged. Instead, he reached out slowly and touched the edge of the note. His fingers hovering just above the paper, as if afraid it would burn him. Purbright leaned in, watching him intently. "You see, Father, the problem is that Sister Agnes knew something. Something that made her a threat to you and to the life you've been leading here, and now because of that she's dead." The priest's mouth tightened, and for a moment Purbright saw something flicker in his eyes, a momentary flash of panic that quickly masked itself with the same practiced composure. But Purbright knew better. The priest's game was unraveling. "Thread by thread, you're wrong," O'Neill muttered under his breath, his voice low, almost pleading. "You don't understand. You don't know what we were dealing with." Purbright's gaze hardened, his voice unwavering. "Then tell me, because right now, Father, I'm not sure I believe you. And if you want to save yourself from what's coming, you'd better start telling the truth." Father O'Neill's hands trembled as he pushed the Bible aside. His mouth worked for a moment, as if trying to find the right words, but nothing came. The silence in the room stretched, thickening around them like a suffocating cloud. Purbright could feel the priest's internal struggle. He was on the brink, so close to a confession, yet reluctant to expose the full extent of his involvement. "Couldn't let her talk," Father O'Neill whispered finally, his voice raw with guilt. She had to be stopped. She had found out too much." Purbright leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Found out what, Father? What exactly did Sister Agnes find out that made you kill her?" The priest's gaze dropped to the table, his hands curling into fists. He inhaled sharply as if gathering his resolve, and then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "It was the letters," he confessed, his voice cracking. "The letters she found, they weren't just innocent letters, Inspector. They were evidence. Evidence of what I've been involved in for years now. What I had to do to protect myself. Protect the church." Purbright's mind raced as the priest's words sank in. Letters. What sort of evidence had Sister Agnes uncovered, and how did it tie into the priest's long-standing involvement in something that warranted such extreme measures? Purbright knew the church had its secrets, but this was something far darker. The letters were about the church's dealings, O'Neill continued, his eyes darkening as he spoke. Things that no one was supposed to know. Not the parishioners, not the authorities. It was all hidden, carefully concealed. And when Sister Agnes found out, when she started asking too many questions, it became a matter of survival. Purbright's pulse quickened, his instincts screaming that he was on the verge of a major breakthrough. What dealings, Father? What was Sister Agnes going to expose? O'Neill looked up at him then, his face pale and drawn. "I was involved in more than just running the parish, Inspector. He stopped himself suddenly, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment it seemed as though he was going to shut down entirely, but the words tumbled out in a rush, as if the floodgates had finally opened. "Money laundering," he whispered hoarsely. "And worse. We were funneling money through the church. There were investors, people with power, and they used the church as a front. The donations, the charity fundraisers, they were all part of it. We hid it behind the facade of goodwill. But Sister Agnes, she knew." Purbright absorbed the words, each one more shocking than the last. Money laundering? Behind the walls? So of the church? It was a dangerous game, and if the priest was to be believed, it was one that had entangled many people in ways Purbright couldn't yet fully comprehend. "And the letters?" Purbright pressed. "What happened to them?" "They're gone," Father O'Neill said, his voice trembling with the weight of his admission. "Sister Agnes took them. She was going to go public. She planned to go to the authorities. She thought she was saving people, but she didn't understand. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, about protecting a system that's been in place for decades, and I couldn't let her destroy everything we had worked for. Purbright's mind reeled as the implications sank in. The priest wasn't just guilty of killing a nun, he was part of a far-reaching network, one that was entangled in criminal activities at the highest level. Sister Agnes had uncovered something, far more dangerous than Purbright had first realized, and now the stakes were higher than ever. "You killed her to protect the secret," Purbright said, his voice steady but seething with contempt. "And you thought that would be the end of it. But you're wrong, Father, because now I'm going to make sure the truth comes out, all of it." O'Neill recoiled, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You can't stop this. You don't know who you're dealing with. They'll come for you." Purbright met his gaze unflinching. "Let them come." The priest's face twisted in disbelief, and for the first time Purbright saw true fear in his eyes. He had underestimated how far Purbright was willing to go to expose the truth. The walls were closing in, and there would be no escape for the priest or anyone involved in this dark web. Purbright stood up, his mind already moving to the next step. "I'm taking you in, Father. You're going to answer for what you've done. And this time, no one will be able to protect you." As he turned to leave, the priest's voice cracked one last time, a feeble cry for mercy. "Please, you don't understand." But Purbright didn't listen. The truth had been laid bare. There was no turning back now. The cold air hit Purbright like a slap in the face as he stepped out of the cathedral lodge, the weight of Father O'Neill's confession settling heavily on his shoulders. Money laundering, church scandals, a network of corruption. It was the kind of revelation that would have shaken Flaxborough to its core if only the town knew. But for now, the only thing that mattered was the truth, and Purbright had learned long ago that the truth was always more complicated than it seemed. His mind kept circling back to the priest's last words. "You don't know who you're dealing with. They'll come for you." Purbright wasn't naive. He understood that power, especially the kind that moved through shadowed back channels and whispered deals, came with consequences. The priest was scared, not for himself, but for the others, the powerful figures whose names would now inevitably come to light, and those people would stop at nothing to protect their empire. But it was too late. Purbright had seen the cracks in the facade, and the truth had a way of prying them open, no matter how carefully they were sealed. The town of Flaxborough had been an island of quiet comfort, where nothing much ever happened and everyone knew everyone else's business. But now that peace had been shattered, and nothing would ever be the same. Purbright's steps were steady as he walked toward the constabulary. He could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on him, the urgency of what needed to be done building with each passing second. He knew that things were about to escalate, and he was ready for whatever came next. As he entered the small, dimly lit station, Constable Harris was waiting for him, his brow furrowed with concern. There was a palpable tension in the air, one that hadn't been there when Purbright had left earlier. "What is it, Harris?" Purbright asked, his voice low, his mind already running through the possibilities. "Sir, we've got a problem," Harris said, his tone clipped. "I just received a message. They've moved Father O'Neill. He's gone, vanished." Purbright's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, vanished? How? He was supposed to be in custody." Harris shook his head, a frown deepening on his face. "We had him secured, sir, but when we went to check on him, his cell was empty. No sign of struggle, nothing out of place. Just gone." Purbright's pulse quickened. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. "They'll come for you." The priest's warning echoed in his thoughts. Someone had orchestrated this, someone with enough power to remove Father O'Neill from the constabulary without anyone noticing, and that meant that whoever was behind this was closer than Purbright had realized. "Who else knew about his detention?" Purbright asked, his voice sharper now. "Just the usual people. Myself, the night shift officers, and a couple of constables who were assigned to his watch, but—" "But?" Purbright pressed. "There's something else, sir," Harris continued, his face pale. "We've had word that there are people asking about the investigation, people who shouldn't be asking." Purbright's eyes narrowed. "People? What do you mean?" Harris hesitated, then leaned in closer, speaking in a low voice. I overheard a conversation between some of the local business owners. They were talking about someone named Lawrence. Apparently, they've been taking an interest in the investigation. They said Lawrence wasn't pleased about the attention on Father O'Neill. Purbright's mind immediately jumped to the name. Lawrence. He had heard it before, in passing, but it hadn't stuck. Now it did. Lawrence was a name that carried weight. He was a shadow in the background, always present in town but never quite visible. A businessman, they said. But what kind of business and how deep did his involvement run? Purbright knew he would need to find out. "Get me everything you can on this, Lawrence," Purbright said, his voice hard. "And get me a team ready to track down O'Neill. Someone has him, and I'll be damned if they think they can get away with it." "Yes, sir," Harris responded quickly, already moving to carry out the orders. Purbright turned on his heel and made his way toward his office, the weight of the investigation pressing down harder than ever. As he sat behind his desk, the world outside seemed to disappear. There was only the task at hand, the relentless pursuit of truth. The priest had confessed, but now the real fight began. Whoever was behind O'Neill's disappearance, whoever had the resources to move him without anyone noticing, was the same person pulling the strings of this web of deceit. Purbright reached for the stack of papers on his desk, notes, witness, statements, and the now infamous letter. He spread them out, each page a piece of the puzzle. The more he looked at the documents, the clearer it became. The money laundering, the church's dark dealings, the hidden world that Sister Agnes had stumbled upon, and now the disappearance of Father O'Neill, an attempt to bury the evidence before it could be revealed. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second a reminder of the urgency. Purbright couldn't afford to wait. If Lawrence was involved, he had to be dealt with. But he couldn't just rush in. This was bigger than Flaxborough. This was about power, secrets, and people willing to kill to keep them safe. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he called, not looking up. Harris entered, his face more serious than before. "Sir, we've got a lead on Lawrence. It's not much, but it's something. He's been seen at the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. We think that's where he's been hiding out, and it looks like he's been getting visits." Purbright stood up, his mind now fully focused. "Get the team. We're going to pay Mr. Lawrence a visit." As they left the station, the wind had picked up, a chill biting through the layers of his coat. The town of Flaxborough had always seemed so quiet, so safe. But now, beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of danger that was growing stronger by the minute. Father O'Neill's disappearance was just the beginning. Whoever was behind this, whoever Lawrence was, would not stop until they had buried the truth for good, and Purbright would be damned if he let that happen. Purbright's breath misted in the chilly air as he stood in front of the old warehouse, its dark silhouette looming ahead like a ghost of the town's past. The building, worn and neglected, was tucked away on the outskirts of Flaxborough, just beyond the edge of the main square. To anyone passing by, it might have looked abandoned. Its rusted windows, chipped paint, and creaking door gave off an air of quiet decay, but Purbright knew better. This was the kind of place where secrets were kept, and the people who dealt in shadows preferred their meetings to go unnoticed. As he surveyed the building, his thoughts kept circling back to Lawrence. The man had always been a mystery, lurking just outside the reach of the law, blending in with the town's quiet rhythms. His name had come up only in whispers, usually when the conversation veered toward Flaxborough's less reputable dealings. But now Purbright knew that Lawrence was at the center of it all, the key to unraveling the web of corruption that had ensnared the town. "Ready, sir," Harris said, his voice breaking through the silence. He was standing next to Purbright. A small team of constables gathered just behind them. Each man looked tense, the weight of what they were about to do hanging in the air. Purbright nodded, his gaze never leaving the warehouse. "Let's keep it quiet. We don't know what we're walking into. Keep your heads down and stay alert." The group moved forward, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. The warehouse was tucked away behind a line of trees, almost invisible, from the main road. As they approached, Purbright couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, the kind of sensation that crept up your spine and made you question every shadow. But he pushed the thought aside. They were too close now. There was no turning back. The door creaked open with surprising ease, the sound cutting through the still night. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the faint glow of a single hanging, light casting long shadows across the rows of empty crates and rusted machinery. The place smelled of mildew and old wood, the kind of smell that seemed to hang in the air for years. Purbright held up his hand, signaling for the team to stop. His eyes scanned the room, every inch of it. He knew they were close. Lawrence had to be here. The question was whether they'd find him in time or if he had already slipped away, just another phantom fading into the night. They moved deeper into the warehouse, the silence heavy around them. The only sound was the creak of the floorboards. Beneath their feet, the faint shuffle of boots and the soft rustling of the wind outside. Purbright's mind raced, running through every scenario, every possibility. Lawrence had been seen here recently, that much was certain. But what if the man had prepared for this moment? What if he was waiting for them? And then, as if on cue, the silence was broken by the sharp sound of a door slamming open at the far end of the warehouse. Purbright's instincts kicked in, his hand going instinctively to the sidearm at his belt. The team immediately spread out, positioning themselves along the edges of the room. Purbright stayed in the middle, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the far corner where the sound had come from. A figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the dim light. The man was tall, his frame imposing as he stepped forward with a slow, deliberate pace. His face was hidden in the darkness, but Purbright knew who it was without needing to see him clearly. Lawrence. There was no mistaking that confident, almost. Smug gait. Well, Inspector, Lawrence's voice rang out, smooth and almost casual, as if he had been expecting them all along. I must say I didn't think you'd be quite so bold as to come looking for me. Purbright's grip tightened on his gun, but he kept his voice steady. I'm not here for a conversation, Lawrence. I'm here to make sure you answer for what you've been hiding. Lawrence chuckled softly, a low, almost mocking sound. Answer for what? I'm just a businessman, Inspector. Nothing more, nothing less. The rest of your little town has been more than happy to turn a blind eye to what goes on here. Why change now? Purbright's patience was wearing thin. You've been hiding behind your business dealings, Lawrence. You've been pulling the strings from the shadows, and now it's time to face the consequences. For the first time, Lawrence's expression faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, but he quickly regained his composure, his smile returning. Consequences? You think you can take me down just like that? You have no idea what you're up against. Purbright stepped forward, his voice low and firm. I know exactly what I'm up against. You've been part of something much bigger than yourself. Money laundering, criminal ties, and now murder, all to protect your empire, but it ends now. Lawrence's smile slipped, replaced by a cold, calculating look. You think you're in control, Inspector? You have no idea how deep this goes. The people I work with, the people who make the decisions, they don't care about a small town like Flaxborough, but they do care about their interests, and if you get in their way, well, you'll be making enemies that even you can't outsmart. Purbright took another step closer, his eyes locked onto Lawrence's. I've dealt with people like you before, people who think they're untouchable, but I've got news for you. No one is untouchable. Before Lawrence could respond, there was a sudden movement from behind him, a shift in the shadows. The sound of footsteps, quick and purposeful. The men were closing in. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Purbright said, his voice steady but with an edge. Lawrence froze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. His expression shifted from calm to one of realization, the brief flicker of fear betraying the illusion of control he had held moments earlier. But it was too late. Purbright was ready, his team closing in on every exit. Lawrence's eyes darted to the side, and in that split second, Purbright acted. With a swift motion, he drew his gun, his finger on the trigger, and fired a warning shot into the air. Stop, Purbright commanded, his voice cold. It's over. Lawrence froze, his body rigid with tension. He had no escape. The game was up. Now, Purbright said, lowering his weapon, we're going to talk, and this time it's on my terms. The weight of the moment settled over them like a thick fog, the reality of what was unfolding finally sinking in. This wasn't just about a man hiding in the shadows. It was about an entire system that had corrupted Flaxborough, a system that Purbright had only begun to peel back. And now, with Lawrence in his sights, Purbright could see the tangled threads of the town's darkest secrets slowly beginning to unravel. Lawrence's eyes remained locked on Purbright, his lips pressed together in a tight line, as if weighing his options in the split second before the game shifted. The warehouse, once a place of quiet menace, now felt like a cage, every corner, every shadow pressing in on him. Purbright's gun, steady in his hand, seemed to shrink the space between them, forcing Lawrence to confront the inevitable. A moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the occasional creak of the building, and the distant rustling of wind against the exterior walls. Then Lawrence broke the silence, his voice low, almost weary. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Inspector. You've already made the mistake of thinking you can take down a system that's been in place for decades, a system that doesn't just involve me, but people who can make things disappear. You'll regret this." Purbright's expression didn't change. "I've heard all the threats before, Lawrence. They don't intimidate me. What you and your people have done here, that's what I'm focused on, and it's over. You're going to answer for it." Lawrence gave a humorless chuckle, stepping back slightly, his posture still rigid but now laced with an air of calculated detachment. "You think this ends with me? You have no idea how many hands are in this town's pockets. But fine, if you think taking me down will solve everything, go ahead. You'll be doing me a favor." Purbright didn't flinch. "You've been hiding behind shadows long enough. Now it's time to drag everything into the light. So let's start with the basics. What's the connection between you and Father O'Neill? Why would he protect you? What's the church really involved in?" Lawrence's eyes flickered for just a moment before he regained his composure. He hesitated, as if considering whether to reveal any more, then sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly as though the fight had drained out of him. "You don't know how deep this runs," Lawrence muttered, his voice low, almost resigned. Father O'Neill wasn't just some naive priest caught up in something he didn't understand. He knew exactly what he was doing. All of this, the church, the donations, the so-called charity work, it's all part of a much bigger plan. We've been laundering money through Flaxborough for years, but it's not just for us. There are bigger players involved. They use this town as a quiet base, a place to wash money, to funnel resources for things you wouldn't believe. The church isn't just a house of worship, it's a front. Purbright's mind raced as he absorbed Lawrence's words. The revelation was staggering, yet it aligned with everything he had uncovered so far. The town, with its seemingly mundane routine, had been a center for something far darker. A small town like Flaxborough had been the perfect cover for a network of crime, its inhabitants blissfully unaware or deliberately ignorant of the truth. "So Father O'Neill was complicit," Purbright said, though it wasn't a question. "But why kill Sister Agnes? What did she find out that threatened everything?" Lawrence stiffened at the mention of Sister Agnes. The name seemed to affect him more than any of Purbright's previous questions. For the first time since their confrontation began, Lawrence looked vulnerable, a shadow crossing his face as if something more than fear was at play. Agnes was different. "She wasn't like the others," Lawrence said, his voice suddenly tinged with something darker. "She started asking questions, too many questions. She found out about the money, about the people we were working with, and she was going to blow the whole thing open. We tried to control it, keep her quiet. But she was relentless. She even started talking to outsiders. That's when we knew she couldn't be allowed to live." Purbright watched him closely, his mind piecing together the story. It made sense now. Sister Agnes had stumbled upon something she couldn't ignore. Something so far-reaching and dangerous that her life had become expendable. She hadn't just been killed for knowing. She'd been killed for what she could have done with that knowledge. She was a loose thread in a tightly controlled operation. "So you had her killed to protect your network," Purbright said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of what had been revealed. "And now you think you can walk away from all of this?" Lawrence's eyes flashed with a mix of frustration and anger. "It's not that simple, Inspector. You think you can just take down one man and expose it all? You have no idea how many people are invested in this, how many lives have been ruined because of it. And now you think you can walk in here and just clean it up. You're out of your depth." This town is full of people who have been bought, controlled, and manipulated for years. It's too late to fix it." Purbright didn't react immediately. He let Lawrence's words hang in the air, feeling the weight of them press down on him. But deep inside, a quiet conviction settled in. Lawrence was right about one thing. This was bigger than any single person, bigger than any of them. But it wasn't too late. Not yet. "You're wrong, Lawrence," Purbright said finally, his voice calm but unyielding. "It's never too late to bring the truth to light, and no one gets away with this, not you, not O'Neill, not any of them." At that moment, Harris and the other constables moved into position, surrounding Lawrence with precise coordination. There would be no escape this time. Purbright took a step back, his eyes never leaving Lawrence's. "You're under arrest," Purbright said, his voice firm, "for the murder of Sister Agnes, for money laundering, and for every other crime you've been involved in. You'll answer for all of it." Lawrence's face twisted, a scowl etched into his features. But there was nothing he could do. No more lies, no more manipulation. The walls were closing in, and Purbright had finally cornered the man who had pulled so many strings in Flaxborough. As the constables moved in to secure Lawrence, Purbright felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that for once the system of power that had kept this town in its grip was starting to crumble. There was still much to uncover, still many questions left unanswered. But the first step had been taken. Flaxborough would never be the same, but it was a town that would finally know the truth. Lawrence was silent as the constables cuffed him, the weight of his arms shackled behind his back, doing little to change the stony expression on his face. He had stopped resisting, the defiance in his eyes replaced by a cold resignation. But the game wasn't over yet. Purbright knew that Lawrence, like most criminals with power, had his connections, people who would try to silence those who came too close to the truth. The priest was only the beginning, and there was still much to be uncovered. The deeper they went, the more dangerous this tangled web of lies would become. Purbright watched as the constables led Lawrence toward the door, the sound of boots on the floor echoing in the large warehouse. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in Lawrence's eyes, perhaps fear or perhaps something darker. It didn't matter. Purbright had him now, and there was no going back. As they stepped outside, the cold night air hit them with a sharp bite, the silence of the town settling in like a heavy fog. The streets were still, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Flaxborough had always been quiet, but tonight it felt different. There was a palpable tension in the air, as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final chapter of its hidden story to unfold. Purbright took a deep breath, the sharp scent of the night air filling his lungs. He had spent years unraveling the small mysteries of Flaxborough, but this was something different. It wasn't just about the murder of a nun, it was about a system, a long-running conspiracy that had poisoned the very heart of the town. And now, with Lawrence in custody, it felt like the first real step toward pulling it all into the light. But even as he stood there looking at the man who had masterminded so much of the darkness in this town, Purbright knew they were still far from the end. Lawrence was just a small part of something much larger, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it would get. "We'll take him in now, sir," Harris said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of their shared responsibility. He seemed to be reading Purbright's thoughts, or perhaps just sensing the quiet wariness that lingered in the inspector's expression. Purbright nodded, his eyes still fixed on Lawrence as he was escorted to the waiting car. "Good, but don't let your guard down. This is just the beginning. We still need to find out who else is involved in this and how far it goes." Harris nodded in agreement, and as the car door slammed shut, the sound seemed to punctuate, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. There were still people out there who had everything to lose, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. As the constables drove off, Purbright turned and made his way back to the station. The weight of the case had begun to settle more heavily on his shoulders, but he wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. Lawrence had revealed a fraction of the truth, but there were still many unanswered questions. What was the full extent of the church's involvement in the operation? How far did Lawrence's influence spread? And what of Father O'Neill? Was he merely a pawn in this game, or had he been playing a part in it all along? Purbright's thoughts turned to Sister Agnes. Her death had been a catalyst, the spark that had set this entire investigation into motion. She had known something that had cost her life. What had she uncovered before she had been silenced? And how had she managed to connect the dots between the money laundering, the church's involvement, and the shadowy figures pulling the strings in Flaxborough? By the time he reached the constabulary, the adrenaline from the confrontation with Lawrence had begun to wear off, replaced by the cold weight of the investigation. He walked into his office and sat down at his desk, the room now quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing through the information he had, trying to piece everything together. "Sir," Harris said, poking his head into the office, "we've just received a report from the hospital. It's about Father O'Neill." Purbright's pulse quickened at the mention of the priest's name. "What about him?" "He's been admitted," Harris continued, stepping inside and handing Purbright a file. "They say he was found unconscious at the old rectory. Looks like he's been drugged. Sedatives, possibly." Purbright took the file and skimmed through the details. "What the hell happened? Was he attacked?" "Not exactly. The doctors say there are no signs of physical trauma, but someone must have gotten to him. We believe it's related to the investigation. He might know something we don't." Purbright's mind immediately went to work connecting the dots. O'Neill had been a key figure in the investigation, his connection to the money laundering operation making him both a victim and a perpetrator. But now, with his sudden collapse, it seemed there was more to the story than anyone had realized. Was someone trying to silence him, or had he been caught in the crossfire of a much larger scheme? "Get me a team ready," Purbright said, standing up and grabbing his coat. "I'm going to the hospital. We need to find out who's behind this and why." As they made their way to the hospital, Purbright's thoughts raced. Whoever had orchestrated O'Neill's collapse was clearly still out there, and now more than ever, they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. But Purbright wasn't backing down. The deeper they went, the closer they were to uncovering everything. As the car pulled up outside the hospital, Purbright's determination only grew. He was getting closer. The truth was just beyond reach, and he would be damned if he didn't pull it into the light. Purbright's mind was a blur of thoughts as he stepped out of the car and into the dimly lit hallway of the hospital. The sterile air, the distant hum of machinery, and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes on the linoleum floor all seemed far removed from the gravity of what was unfolding. But his focus remained sharp. Father O'Neill's sudden collapse was no accident. Someone was still working hard to cover up their tracks, and Purbright needed to find out who before they disappeared too. "Room 316, Harris muttered as he led the way, glancing over his shoulder at Purbright. "That's where they've got him. No visitors allowed yet, but we've got the chief nurse's approval." Purbright nodded, his hand tightening around his coat collar as they reached the door. He could hear soft murmurs coming from inside, the occasional rustle of sheets. He pushed the door open quietly, careful not to disturb the room's fragile quiet. Father O'Neill lay on the bed, his face pale, a thin line of sweat coating his brow. The sedatives had done their work. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling steadily, but there was an unsettling stillness about him. A nurse was standing near the bed, her back to them. She turned as they entered, her face betraying no emotion. "Inspector," she said in a tone that was professional but slightly weary, "I understand you need to speak with him, but he's heavily sedated. It might be a while before he's coherent." "That's fine," Purbright replied, stepping closer to the bed. He examined O'Neill for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied the priest's unconscious form. There was something in the way the priest was lying there, something too perfect, too controlled. It didn't feel like the collapse of a man who had simply been overwhelmed. It felt staged. "We need answers," Purbright added, his voice steady. "He's been involved in something big, bigger than even we realized. If he knows anything, we need him to wake up sooner rather than later." The nurse nodded, stepping aside as Harris pulled up a chair. Purbright sat down, his eyes fixed on O'Neill's face. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the minutes stretching into a tense silence that filled the room. Purbright had always known that things were going to get worse before they got better. But now, with Father O'Neill in a hospital bed and Lawrence in custody, he could feel the walls closing in on the people behind this scheme. There was something more to this operation, something that had yet to be uncovered. and O'Neill was the key. As he sat there watching the priest's slow, shallow breaths, Purbright's thoughts wandered to the events of the past few days. The murder of Sister Agnes had ignited something that had exposed a far-reaching conspiracy in the heart of Flaxborough. The town, so long a place of quiet normalcy, had been hiding secrets that went beyond money laundering. There were lives at stake, people whose fates had been sealed by the greed and corruption of a select few. And now it was up to Purbright to make sure they didn't get away with it. The quiet hum of the room was interrupted by a soft sound, the faintest stirring from the bed. Purbright's attention snapped back to Father O'Neill. The priest's eyelids fluttered open, his gaze unfocused at first and then slowly clearing as he blinked several times. "Inspector." O'Neill's voice was hoarse, weak, but it was enough to draw Purbright in. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving the priest's face. "Father," Purbright said gently but with urgency, "we need to talk. You've been drugged, but you need to listen to me. You've got information that could bring everything to light. It's time to tell the truth." O'Neill's eyes flickered with recognition, his lips pressing together as he took shallow breaths. He seemed disoriented, but there was an underlying tension in his posture, as though he knew exactly why he was being kept in the dark. His gaze fixed on Purbright, his expression hardening. I don't know what you think I can tell you," O'Neill rasped, his voice barely audible. I'm no hero, Inspector. I've done things I can never undo." Purbright's heart rate picked up. "It's not too late, Father. You're in danger. The people you've been protecting, the ones you've been covering for, they're going to come for you. But you can stop it. You can stop them from hurting anyone else." O'Neill's face tightened and he looked away, clearly struggling with his thoughts. "I should never have gotten involved," he whispered. "But they have power. Power that reaches beyond this town. I never thought it would get this far. I never thought it would cost her life." Purbright leaned in, his voice steady but insistent. "You're talking about Sister Agnes. You're talking about why she had to die, aren't you?" Father O'Neill's eyes widened slightly, and he looked at Purbright with a mixture of fear and guilt. "I didn't want it to end like this, but she knew too much. She had started asking questions about the money, about the people we were really dealing with. She knew I couldn't protect her from them." Purbright felt a chill settle in his chest. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and they were darker than he had imagined. "Who were you working with, Father? Who else is involved in this?" O'Neill closed his eyes, and for a moment, Purbright thought he had lost him again. But then, with a pained sigh, O'Neill spoke. "They were involved with people from outside the town, powerful people, business figures with connections, but they weren't just laundering money. They were using the church as a front for something much worse. And when Agnes started to dig, they realized she couldn't be allowed to talk. Not if they were going to keep their empire intact." Purbright clenched his fists. "You don't have to protect them anymore, Father. This is your chance to make it right. You can help bring them down." O'Neill swallowed hard, his eyes filled with regret. "I can't. I wish I could, but I'm too far gone. They've already made sure I can't say anything more." Purbright was about to press him further when there was a sudden knock at the door. A nurse entered, looking at them both with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Inspector, I'm sorry, but Father O'Neill needs rest. He's barely recovered from the sedatives we gave him. He's not in any shape to continue this conversation right now." Purbright's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "All right, we'll talk again soon, Father. I'll be back." As the nurse ushered him out of the room, Purbright stood in the corridor, his mind racing. He had pieces of the puzzle, but there was still so much left to uncover. Lawrence was in custody, but there were still many people out there. People with power, with influence, who were desperate to keep their secrets hidden. And as long as O'Neill remained alive, there was still hope that he might be able to reveal everything. Purbright turned and walked toward the exit, his resolve hardening. With each step, the truth was out there and he was going to find it, no matter the cost.